I'm very excited about today as we get into another episode of Subject Matter Expert here. We have Professor Avi Loeb on the show today. Professor Loeb is a theoretical physicist, astrophysicist, an author, a Harvard professor specializing in cosmology and astrophysics. You got your PhD from Hebrew University of Jerusalem before moving to the United States. You were the longest serving chair of the Harvard Astronomy Department. And you're currently leading the Galileo Project, which I'd love to get into in a little bit here. But Avi, thanks for coming on.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. But I should say that if you want to understand me, you should go back to my roots. And I grew up on a farm, collected eggs every afternoon, drove the tractor to the hills of the village and read the philosophy books. This is sort of my initial inclinations, connection to nature, enjoying nature more than people. I don't have any footprint on social media. And the second thing is thinking about the big questions, because we live for such a short time. So we better focus on substance rather than nonsense.
I agree. And that's some of your background. As we were talking before we started this call here, you grew up in Israel, and as is compulsory, I believe, in Israel, you served in the Israeli Defense Forces and got to do a few different things. We both share in common that we jumped out of airplanes in service of our country at one point. And right. You ended up in a special program and ultimately working in an American-funded program. You were telling me Star Wars. Another connection that we have, Avi, my dad, actually, he was an Army reservist in the 80s, and he was one of he was an ammunition specialist or munitions specialist, but not, rifle ammunition, large ordnance. He was sent over to Europe to be the person that implemented some of the Star Wars program and moving around nuclear munitions and things like that. So you were involved in a very different way of the Star Wars program, I think.
Well, actually, the Star Wars program was the foundation for what now is called the Golden Dome, or this space initiative to protect the United States against any threat from space. And I was fortunate to be involved in that because General Abramson, who led the program under President Reagan, came to visit Israel, and I presented an idea for a project, and it was selected as the first international project. When I was drafted to the military, we were supposed to study physics and mathematics. I ended up finishing my PhD at age 24, but this project was sort of an initiative that was not anticipated. I was supposed to do things that are local, but I ended up visiting Washington several times a year because we were funded at a few $1 million a year. And in one of the visits, I was introduced to the Institute for Advanced Study. An administrator there agreed for me to visit after I was in Washington, and then I met Freeman Dyson because he was the only person who had free time. All the others were busy, and he was sort of getting towards the end of his career. And he introduced me to John Bacall, an astrophysicist, who ended up offering me a 5-year fellowship under one condition, that I'll switch to astrophysics. And it was very humbling because I didn't know how the sun shines. And for me to enter into a new territory was quite challenging. There were all these bright young people that were trying to show that they're smarter than anyone else around them, and I didn't even know the vocabulary. I had to learn, how a star shines, what is a cluster of galaxies, what is the Big Bang, how things started, and it took me 5 years to learn all this vocabulary, but I managed to pull myself up, and then I accepted an offer from Harvard University just because nobody wanted it. The chance for tenure were extremely small. For 20 years, they haven't tenured anyone. And so I just went there because I always had plan B. I could always go back to the farm. I wasn't worried about having no job. I enjoyed being in nature, so I would continue my father's legacy and work in the farm. But Harvard ended up making me a tenured offer after Cornell did. So at that point, it seemed like I have to accept it. It's like The Godfather. It's kind of an offer that is rare, and you can't say no to. But I realized that even though it was an arranged marriage, I'm actually married to my true love, because I can address very fundamental questions about our existence, and using the scientific method. So here I am. I'm not a typical academic. I was good in sports and I still jog every morning. I'm not a typical nerd in terms of being a physicist trying to show off by doing mathematical gymnastics. I'm interested in big questions and I'm using the scientific method to pursue them. So I'm different also from philosophers who speak for, they talk with each other forever, or from journalists that talk to other people and try to report what they say. I'm in the trenches doing the scientific work, but it's dedicated to fundamental questions. And the most romantic question in science is: Are we alone? Do we have a partner out there? And when Enrico Fermi asked in 1950, he was in Los Alamos, after the Manhattan Project, and they were talking with Edward Teller about extraterrestrials. It was a subject they found interesting, and they said, well, it's probably it's very likely that they're out there. But Fermi asked, where is everybody? And if I was next to Enrico Fermi at that time in Los Alamos, I would approach him and put my hand around his shoulder and say, Enrico, don't be so presumptuous. This is a question that every lonely person asks. And what you tell them is, you're not that attractive when you ask, where is everybody? Where is my partner? They will not come to you. You have to search for them. And, Enrico didn't build a telescope. He didn't search. He didn't look for evidence. He was expecting they will show up at lunch in Los Alamos. And why would they do that? So this is, to me, a very important, an example for a very important existential question, because once we find them, everything would change. Our perception about our place in the universe, our thoughts about religion, what we plan to do in the future. Instead of going to another rock, like everyone is speaking about going to Mars or the moon, these are just rocks that happen to be near us. It's just like being in the jungle and jumping from one tree to another tree. It sounds visionary. You live on a tree and then you see another tree nearby and you jump onto it. So I'm sure that some of our ancestors, the chimpanzees, they thought it's a great idea to be able to jump to another tree. That's amazing. How can you think about that? But, that's very limited because there is so much real estate beyond the solar system in interstellar space that we might be inspired to pursue if we find a partner.
Yeah, and I would love to talk more about how everything would or will change once we do figure out who else is out in the universe. But I think right now that leads us directly into something that's very topical right now. We're getting very close to getting very close observation on 3I Atlas. And I just would love for people that maybe haven't been following it as closely, why is that important right now? And also, this is only the third interstellar object that has come into our solar system. Why has there only been three or three that we've been able to observe?
Right. We just discovered three, but there are many more. And we started developing the instruments that are capable of noticing them only over the past decade. These are survey telescopes. The reason they were developed is Congress tasked NASA to find 90% of all the objects bigger than a football field that come close to Earth. These are called near-Earth objects. And we know about the story about the dinosaurs. They were killed by a giant rock asteroid the size of Manhattan Island. They didn't look up. That was their mistake. We are more intelligent than they are. We are looking up. So the Congress tasked NASA to find 90% of all these objects bigger than a football field. Now, the one that killed the dinosaurs was the size of Manhattan Island. So we know all of those big ones, but we're still interested in objects of order 100 meters because they can cause a lot of damage, and aerial damage, more than the size of New York City. They can really be much more powerful than the biggest nuclear bomb that we ever developed. So if they impact the Earth. So we are worried about them. And as a result, these survey telescopes, like, for example, Pan-STARRS in Hawaii, or most recently, the Rubin Observatory in Chile, they were funded by the National Science Foundation, by Department of Energy, and by NASA, in order to search for such near-Earth objects. And back in 2017, they saw one, but they noticed that it's moving really fast, so fast that it can be bound by gravity to the sun. So that was the first interstellar object noticed. It was given the name Oumuamua, which means a scout in the Hawaiian language, roughly the size of a football field. But it was really strange because as it was tumbling every 8 hours, the amount of sunlight reflected from it changed by a factor of 10. So that meant it has a very extreme shape, most likely flat, like a pancake. And moreover, it was pushed away from the sun by some mysterious force, and it didn't shed any mass. There was no gas or dust around it. And so it wasn't a comet. And so the question was, what is pushing it? And I thought maybe it's the sunlight pushing it, just the reflection of sunlight. If it's thin enough, it will have a large area for its mass, so it can be pushed by reflecting sunlight. And actually, 2 years later, the same telescope discovered another object, which was definitely pushed by reflecting sunlight, ended up being a rocket booster from 1966, launched by NASA. And we know that it's technological because we produced it. Mm-hmm. The question is who produced Oumuamua. And we will never know that because there was very limited data collected. The astronomers at first called it a comet. And then when it was clear that it's not a comet, at least we don't see evidence for gas or dust around it, which is the defining property of a comet. It's just like the stripes on a zebra. Mm-hmm. So then they called it an asteroid, but then it was pushed away from the sun. And so they said, well, maybe it's a dark comet. That's what some of the experts are now saying, which is an oxymoron because it's basically an object which is being pushed away from the sun, but has no evaporation. It doesn't have a cometary tail. So in my mind, it's just like looking at a different animal, like looking at an elephant, and you are familiar with finding zebras, and then you see that the elephant has no stripes. So you call it, instead of calling it a new animal, you say it's a zebra without stripes. So it's a dark comet, which, it takes away any confidence you have in the integrity of the scientific process because, these experts are calling it in the name of something familiar, even though they have no evidence for this something familiar. There is no cometary evaporation. Why do you call it a comet in the case of Oumuamua? Anyway, the second object discovered, 2019, that was definitely a comet. It looked just like the comets we have in the solar system, and it was given the name Borisov. Mm-hmm. And then the third one was the one discovered on July 1st this year, 2025, given the name 3I, which means the third interstellar, Atlas. Atlas was the name of the telescope in Chile that discovered it. And as it was discovered the same night, I realized that it was very bright. And if you assume that the brightness stems from just the reflection of sunlight, you would conclude that it has a size, a diameter of about 20 kilometers, comparable to Manhattan Island. It's huge. And it's much bigger than Oumuamua, which was about 100 meters. Just think about the size of a football field compared to the size of Manhattan. So it doesn't make much sense to have, a small object and then immediately something that is bigger by a factor of 100. How is that possible? And the analogy that I make is, the mass is 1,000,000 times if the size is 100 times bigger. Mm-hmm. The analogy I make is with a cat. Suppose you see an animal in your backyard and, the experts tell you, well, it must be a street cat. Okay. And then you realize this animal is 1,000,000 times more massive than a previous animal that it was a cat, or at least 1,000 times more massive than that. So, and then they say, yeah, but cats are common, so it's probably a cat. And then what you see is that it has a tail that goes out of its forehead. It's not coming from its rear end. And that was the case with 3i Atlas. There was a plume of scattered light that looked more like a cigar, extending 10 times longer than it was wide, towards the sun. So we saw glow ahead of the object towards the sun, instead of what happens typically with comets, that they lose dust or gas that leaves their surface, and then the dust scatters sunlight. But as a result of that, it gets pushed behind the object, and that's how you get a cometary tail, when the dust is pushed away from the sun. But in the case of 3i Atlas, we saw the scattered light towards the sun. So it's like having an animal with a tail coming out of its forehead. And I said, well, so the experts looked at the image that came from the Hubble Space Telescope, and they said, well, it's a cat because it has a tail, but it's not a tail, it's an anti-tail. And that they omitted. So when NASA says, well, it's a comet, they do not pay attention to the fact that it has unusual properties, anomalous properties. And then, so not only it's big, and therefore, we should have seen 1 million objects like Oumuamua before seeing one that is as big as this one, just because there is limited mass to provide you with such a big one. There is also not enough rocky material in interstellar space to deliver such an object over the past decade. You would expect it once per 10,000 years or longer. And then it goes on a path that is perfectly aligned with the planets around the sun to within 5 degrees. And the chance of that happening at random is 1 in 500. So why would such an object have a fine-tuned trajectory? And one possibility is because the path was designed by some intelligence. There is a purpose for the visit. And, a size of order tens of kilometers is roughly the size of Rama in the story Rendezvous with Rama that Arthur C. Clarke wrote, the famous novel. So that is the fundamental question. Is it really a natural object like a comet? And if so, why does it have this unusual tail ahead of it, at least during July and August? That was the case. In the best image we got of it. Also, people measured the composition of the gas around it, and we found that it's mostly carbon dioxide. 87% is carbon dioxide, in difference from what you expect from a typical comet that has water. And then, in addition, there was nickel without iron detected coming out of it, and cyanide. Now, nickel without iron, the only place we find it is in industrial production of nickel alloys. In nature, in all the other comets that were looked at in the past, you find nickel and iron with comparable amounts. And in this one, just nickel, no iron. So I'm saying, look, this is a bit strange, and it also arrives to the inner solar system at a very special time, such that it comes very close to Mars. Actually, on Friday,
I was going to say, in the next few days here, we've got the Mars Express and ExoMars TGO are going to get the best look I think that we're going to get of it in the next week here. It's going to come within 30 million kilometers of Mars.
Yes.
Of Mars or of Earth?
No, of Mars. It will not come close to Earth. But there is also NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter that has perhaps the best camera called HiRISE that will be able to capture an image of 3i Atlas with a pixel resolution of 30 kilometers. And I'm very much looking forward to that in a few days, because, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I don't care what other people say. The picture will give us a very tight constraint on the size of the object. I can already say that it's probably bigger than 5 kilometers. We just wrote a paper about that with my colleagues that was basically using the fact that there is no evidence for non-gravitational acceleration of this object. It's basically following a path that is dictated just by gravity, perfectly, for about 4.5 months. And based on that, we can say that the object is very massive because it's losing mass, and you would expect that its evaporation on the side that faces the sun gives it a push, but we don't notice any push, so that means that it's very massive, and we get a lower limit on the mass of the object that is about 33 billion tons. Okay, that's the minimum mass of the object, 33 billion tons, and that corresponds to a diameter bigger than 5 kilometers. So that's the smallest size, and then it could be bigger than that. It can be all the way up to 45 kilometers based on other data that we have. So it's a big beast. It's a large animal with a tail coming from its forehead, shedding nickel. I'm not sure I would call it a cat or a comet without getting more data, and that's basically my point. I defined a scale that is now called the Loeb scale, where a rank of 0 means a natural object, and a rank of 10 means a technological object that could be a threat to humanity. And as of now, I give it a 4, but that's so most of the odds are that it's natural, but this is a high rank because you want to have a contingency plan if it turns out to be technological.
I think that's important to note. I think with any of these extraterrestrial objects or interstellar objects that you've identified over the years, you've never said this is for sure an extraterrestrial intelligent life form. You're saying that's just one of the things that it could possibly be of the many things that it could be. And so I think that's important to point out. But specifically with these higher resolution images that we're going to receive here in the next week or so, hopefully, what do you think in your experience you'll be able to definitively say with those images? What will you be able to rule out, and what's the best case scenario you could hope for?
Oh, the best case scenario is that we will have a few pixels resolution of this object, that it's actually as big as 30 kilometers or maybe even up to 45 kilometers. And then we would be able to see the object with a few pixels. However, even if it's smaller than that, even if it's 10 kilometers or 5 kilometers, we would be able to know its size, its diameter, because the brightest pixel that in the image will tell us how much sunlight is reflected from the object. So assuming a typical reflectance that we know of, we will get the area of the object that reflects the sunlight. The cloud of gas around it is transparent. We can see through it. It's just a question of getting a high resolution image so we can tell, how bright is the brightest pixel. And the previous image we had was from the Hubble Space Telescope. It was 100 times worse than we can get from HiRISE. And I actually had a phone call from Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna, who wanted to know more about the 3A Atlas. And I mentioned to her that NASA has access to important assets in space that can be used to get more data, including the time when 3I Atlas will pass very close to Jupiter. That will be March 16th, 2026. And there we have the Juno spacecraft, and Representative Luna wrote a letter to the current administrator of NASA, Sean Duffy, encouraging him to use Juno and other facilities. So I very much hope that we will have a lot of data, because that's the best way for us to learn rather than have a prejudice. And my hope is once we have a lot of data, it will become clear what the nature of this object is. And if we know how big it is, it would be really difficult to accommodate a giant rock that is tens of kilometers in size, because it's just too massive, for it to arrive to our neighborhood at random. That's based on my calculations. And when I say too massive, I mean by orders of magnitude, by not by a factor of 2, but by a factor of thousands or even millions. And so let's see how big it is. That's the first thing. And then, we can potentially detect artificial light coming from it. Just yesterday, I realized that the direction from where this 3i Atlas is coming is very close to the center of the Milky Way galaxy in the sky, and it's called the Sagittarius region.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that on August 15th, 1977, there was a detection of a radio signal from that direction called the WOW signal, which was definitely extraterrestrial. And back at the time, people who were searching for intelligent civilizations through radio signals were struck by it. And it was very puzzling. Why is it coming from there? And what is the source of that? But this was unresolved because since then we never saw a signal as bright as the WOW signal. And I just realized last night that it came within a distance of 9 degrees from the direction of 3i Atlas. So that's really a coincidence. And also the velocity that was inferred for the source was of order 10 kilometers, because we could see it was a narrow band signal of very close to the hydrogen line, and it was blue shifted as if the source is moving at 10 kilometers per second. And actually, 3i Atlas is moving towards the sun at about 60 kilometers per second. So you would have gotten a blue shifted signal. I calculated that back in 1977, 3i Atlas was at a distance of 600 times the Earth-Sun separation. So it was far. It's about 3 light days. And so you needed, in order to get the signal that was detected, the brightness of it, the intensity of it, the source had to have a power of about a gigawatt, which is the typical power that a nuclear reactor on Earth has. So in terms of technology, it's possible that the WOW signal that was enigmatic since 1977 came from roughly the same direction. And I encouraged radio observers to look at 3i Atlas and check whether it has any radio transmission, which so far they haven't done so. Nothing was reported. But given that the WOW signal came from the same direction in the sky, I would encourage them to take data before we lose 3i Atlas.
The WOW signal, and you just published this essay last night, and I'll make sure we link to your site where you publish a lot of this analysis. And that was kind of one of my questions is I read what you wrote about the WOW signal, not having a background in astrophysics, the WOW signal, what the images even that you were posting in there might as well have been Greek for me. And spoiler alert, I don't speak Greek. So, that was, you kind of answered it. I was wondering like, what is the importance if it is coming from there? But obviously if it's coming from there, then that definitely means something. If this thing is producing radio signals, that's not a comet or an asteroid. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Right. I mean, you don't get radio signals from a rock.
Mm-hmm. Not my experience.
Yeah. The way to think of this is, any interstellar object entering the solar system, the professional astronomers assume that it's either an asteroid or a comet. An asteroid is just a bare rock, whereas a comet has some ice on it that gets evaporated when it comes close to the sun, and that's why you see a cometary tail around a comet. But any object moving through interstellar space would accumulate ices because it's freezing out there, and so when it comes close to the sun, you would see some evaporation. That's what people don't realize, that the existence of some gas around it, from ices that were on the surface, is just telling you what's on the skin of the object. And as we all know, you can't judge a book by its cover. So if you just see what lies on the skin of the object, it doesn't tell you that it's necessarily natural. And in this case, we saw CO2, carbon dioxide mostly, but we also saw nickel without iron and cyanide. And, it looks a little unusual. I mean, these things are not often seen in the comets that we know about. And Also, the light from it had a very unusual negative polarization. I'm just saying, let's keep our minds open, because once we argue, dogmatically that any object in the sky that has some cloud of gas around it must be a comet, we lose the opportunity to learn something new. And that was the biggest mistake of the Vatican. When Galileo said, "I'm looking through my telescope, I see moons moving around Jupiter, and therefore not everything revolves around the Earth." That was his conclusion. The Vatican said, "No, we will put you in house arrest. We don't want, today he would have been canceled on social media. We don't want you to be heard," basically. That's what they told him. And then 350 years later, they admitted that he was right. That was in 1992. And to me, it looks like a very embarrassing public relations act on the side of the Vatican, because, they should have said, we have more money than you do. We will build a bigger and better telescope and show that you're wrong. And then they would have found that he's right, and save themselves from this embarrassment.
Yeah, I want to clarify there. So the Vatican, the Catholic Church, didn't admit that Galileo was right until 1992.
Yes.
It blows my mind that it took until the late 20th century for an institution like the Catholic Church to admit that Galileo was right. And maybe some of these issues that you run into with the larger scientific community these days are maybe not so surprising. We're just seeing human patterns here that don't want to admit change or the possibility of change.
I feel much more fortunate than Galileo because, aside from what happened during the pandemic, that I had to stay at home, nobody puts me in house arrest. But I do feel that there is this resistance for being open-minded about some questions. And, the common denominator is that the church wanted the humans to be at the center of the universe because that was serving its politics to tell people that they're important and God looks at what they're doing, and so they didn't want the alternative to be right, and now the question of whether we are at the intellectual center of the universe is also being threatened. If there is a smarter kid on the block, we are not the smartest that ever existed. And I can understand where it's coming from, because I watched my two daughters when they were infants, and when they were at home and the only data set they had was what they see around them, they thought that they're at the center of the universe because we paid a lot of attention to them. But they started noticing that there are other houses on the street, but as they grew a bit older and could look through the windows, and that's where we are right now. We see a lot of Earth-Sun analogs in our cosmic street, but they never had an idea that there might be other kids like them in those houses until they went on the first day to the kindergarten. And then, of course, they had a shock, psychological shock, and they matured very quickly because they saw some kids that are smarter than them. And I think we are still at the phase, we are not mature yet. We still doubt that there are residents in the houses on the street that we see. These are Earth-Sun systems. So the astronomy community is willing to invest more than $10 billion in searching for microbes in these houses, which is very challenging, from the vantage point of your home, to look through the windows and figure out if there are microbes in other houses. And I'm just saying, look, even if there is only one resident, there might be a tennis ball in our backyard that this resident threw away, or that resident might show up at our front door one day, or you might see from a distance a construction project in the backyard of that resident. And all of these might be much easier to detect than microbes. So I think we should hedge our bets and just put billions of dollars to the search for intelligence, not just to the search for microbes. Because frankly, if we find intelligence, it will have a bigger impact on our future. We can learn from them, new science, new technology. I find intelligence far more inspiring than microbes.
Yeah, and You've talked before about sort of the allocation. There's only so many dollars to go around for scientific research, right? And
Right.
you've talked before about whether it's microbes or looking at other dimensions or dark matter or things that there's not really any solid scientific proof that what you're looking for even exists, much like extraterrestrial interplanet or extraterrestrial intelligent life. One thing that I was thinking about is I think that there actually is, it's very possible that there's a connection between, if we're searching for other dimensions, that we're also searching for intelligent life. Because I think the first, if and when we do come across extraterrestrial intelligent life, the next question after, like, okay, it exists, is, well, where did they come from? And there's no guarantee. If we can't, as far out as we can look almost to the edges of the universe right now, as far as like what light has been able to reach us so far. We can see pretty far. And if we haven't found it yet, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it's just we haven't seen it yet. And so it would be prudent to not rule out that if we do find life outside this planet, that it may not be from this dimension. So do you think that the two theoretical possibilities are maybe in some ways could be linked?
Well, you see, the science that we are using to search for intelligence. And by the way, it's not a high priority. As I mentioned, the highest priority is to search for microbes within the mainstream of. So if you are not investing money or time in the search, you will not find anything. When people say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, I say extraordinary evidence requires extraordinary funding. So without putting the money and the resources, we are unlikely to find it. And, it's a circular argument to say we don't have evidence as of yet when we don't make it a priority. But in the way we search, obviously we are biased by only 1 century of modern science. Quantum mechanics was discovered exactly 100 years ago. And I was actually at the Niels Bohr Institute where it was discovered a few weeks ago. And I was in the auditorium where Niels Bohr was sitting next to Werner Heisenberg, next to Lev Landau, Wolfgang Pauli. So when I sat on the bench, the wooden bench, they told me, "Oh, you're just sitting where Wolfgang Pauli sat." And I felt honored. But the only thing I could think of is how uncomfortable this bench is. It was just wood. They had really low quality of life back then, 100 years ago. But nevertheless, it was inspiring. And I wish I was there 95 years ago when they discovered the foundations of quantum mechanics, because they were open-minded. Back then, there were no people that would ridicule by making some blog post or by making some video on YouTube, ridicule ideas about the reality that we're not aware of, because quantum mechanics was telling us that the physical reality is very different from what our intuition says. It's probabilistic. An electron can be in multiple places at the same time, which sounds counterintuitive. And when you find it in one place, it immediately eliminates what happens at another place even faster than light. This is the concept of entanglement. And so these ideas, I'm sure, would have been ridiculed on social media if they were. But the point is that you have to be open-minded. You have to discuss possibilities, because our imagination is not as great as nature. And so here is an example where we didn't imagine quantum physics, and it happens to be the most fundamental description of reality, okay, as far as we know as of now. But you are completely correct that we may have a very partial view of reality, because, and I'm not talking necessarily about extra dimensions, but we don't know what most of the matter in the universe is. We call it dark matter. We don't know what most of the energy is. We call it dark energy. We don't know how to unify quantum mechanics and gravity. And it may well be that advanced civilizations are using all of this knowledge in ways that we cannot detect, because we cannot detect dark matter. We just see that its effect through gravity, and the same with dark energy. And just imagine that they're using dark matter as fuel. Okay, you won't be able to see it. It's the best stealth engine. You can't see anything coming from the exhaust because it's dark matter. Or if they use quantum gravity for propulsion, these are concepts that we have no idea about. So you don't need to think necessarily about extra dimensions to realize that, the way we search for them might be too limited and we are missing them. But another thing to keep in mind is, I once calculated, suppose there is a nuclear war on a planet, can we detect the explosions if we look at it at the right time? And the answer is no. Even if you had a global world war that is completely nuclear, we won't be able to detect it by orders of magnitude from the nearest star. The nearest Alpha Centauri system is not close enough by orders of magnitude. And with our very best telescopes, we won't be able to detect the flare that comes from a global nuclear war on a habitable planet like, for example, Proxima Centauri b, which is the nearest to the solar system. So, even our telescopes right now, require huge amounts of power from the whoever creates a technological signature for us to be able to see it at a large distance. And that is another factor we need to take into account, that maybe, they are quite subtle, and the effects they make are not easy to detect. There is also this idea that those that were visible and easily visible were already destroyed or killed or captured, because it's just like a dark forest where there are predators, and so if you want to survive, you better not make a sound. And unfortunately, humanity was not careful enough. For 100 years, we transmitted radio signals, so they may show up at our front door, these predators one day, and that's my worry about the 3i Atlas.
Yeah, the way I've always liked to think about it is, we didn't know UV rays, ultraviolet rays, existed for a long time. They existed, we just couldn't see them.
Exactly, and also infrared. Infrared is more important because, as you know, in the military, if you put the goggles, you can see humans or tanks that are not visible to the human eye, because they don't emit visible light at night, but instead they emit heat, infrared radiation, which was discovered by an astronomer. Yeah, infrared light is not something that our eyes are sensitive to. And by the way, the astronomer that discovered it is Herschel, who also was a musician, a composer. He has beautiful musical pieces that I highly recommend.
I didn't know that he made music. I know him as a scientist. I recognize the name at least, but I didn't know he made music as well.
And he discovered infrared radiation that was not known before him. So, because if you think about it, the human eye was, evolved, developed to be sensitive to sunlight. And that's important for survival, because the sunlight is reflected from predators, from objects. And in order to survive in an environment that is illuminated by sunlight, you need sensitivity to that light. But the infrared radiation is not as essential for that. And if we were to live, for example, near a dwarf star like Proxima Centauri that emits only infrared, then I'm sure we would have infrared eyes, which, there are animals that have infrared eyes, like the mantis shrimp, for example. It's sensitive.
Really?
Yeah. And if we were to live near a neutron star that emits X-rays, then we might have had X-ray sensors, like you find in the airport. The kind of animals you have near different sources of light would have different sensors, and they would usually reflect the type of light emitted by the host star, because that's useful for survival.
Yeah, I've actually thought about that a lot. I've always wondered, some of the very rural regions of Afghanistan that I went into while I was still in the military, and thinking about some of those folks that had no idea that we could see in the dark, they could not, or at least not any more than the moon allowed on any given night, which sometimes is actually really good, to the point where we wouldn't use night vision. But then also the fact that, we used infrared lasers on our rifles. We had infrared lasers, large ones, coming down from the sky to illuminate what building, what person, people were around. Like, And just to the person that wasn't looking through the lens of a night vision device, would have no idea that any of this stuff is
Exactly.
around.
Well, just
And
think about the Iranian defense system when the B-2 bombers showed overhead.
mhm,
They had no clue as to what to do about it. And so, and this, we are talking here about a gap in technological abilities of only several decades.
mhm.
But think about a million years or a billion years difference between us and another civilization. In that case, even the issue of communication. How do you communicate with them if they are much more capable than we are? They might operate on a different level, a different plane.
We
It's
can't
just,
communicate with all forms of life on Earth right now.
yeah, exactly. But just think about the perspective of ants in the cracks of a pavement. From that vantage point of a crack in the pavement, they are looking at the biker passing by, and they have no way of communicating with the biker. These ants, and we might feel exactly the same way when we see an interstellar object passing near
Ha-
us.
have you seen the movie Arrival?
Yes.
That
Not only that, but the person who produced it, Dan Levine, is now producing a documentary about my research that will come out on Netflix
really.
in 2026. Yeah,
I'm looking forward to that. And I think about that movie and how it really, I think, beautifully explained how there can be a gap in communication, how important
exactly.
communication is, and how it
Yeah.
might not be as straightforward as literal verbal words coming out of
No,
a
that
mouth.
was the beauty of this film, which I find to be one of the best science fiction films. I enjoyed it a lot, and also for the fact that when there is a challenge about communication, the person who solves that challenge is a woman, because she was a woman scientist. Because women are much better at communication.
Yep. You're an author. I've got a book right over my shoulder here. It's about a naval cryptologist named Shannon Kent, and she was tragically killed in Syria in 2019 while hunting the leaders of ISIS. But sort of her superpower, among many things, was she spoke 5 different languages, and including different dialects, about 8 different languages, and was incredible about that. And that's one thing. And she also had red hair. She also, I couldn't help but think about her and the subject of my book. In the context of watching that film Arrival, who
Yeah.
the protagonist of that film is, somebody that's specialized in language, and
Yeah,
it's very interesting.
Speaking about language, I led an expedition to the Pacific Ocean a couple of years ago that will be in the Netflix documentary. They came with us on the ship, and we went there. By the way, the party chief, the person who navigated the ship, he was a commander of a destroyer during the Vietnam War, and I really admired him because he wouldn't speak much, but and he would solve all the problems that he can on his own and only discuss things that he needs help with. And it's exactly the opposite culture to what you find nowadays on social media, which is virtue signaling. And he was not trying to show off, and just to solve problems and help everyone. And this kind of sense of helping the mission, making it successful, is something that I remember from playing sports. That also is common there, but it's very different from what you find in academia, where everyone is trying to bring you down and to dismiss what you're saying, to criticize it, because they think it's a zero-sum game. If you get some recognition, it takes away their prospects of being recognized. And it's really unfortunate that we have this culture in academia, because it also leads a lot of scientists to work on things that will just demonstrate that they're smart and show off, and not necessarily describe reality. They can work on ideas that have nothing to do with the physical reality, as long as they demonstrate that they are smart, doing some intellectual virtuosity that is appreciated by their peers. And I think that's really wrong. And it's wrong because science is supposed to reflect the interests of the public, to be based on common sense, and if we know that we exist and we see a lot of Earth-Sun systems, billions of them in the Milky Way galaxy, it's a matter of common sense to say, okay, well, let's search for things like us. Like this is not very speculative. And on the other hand, if you just say, I want instead to work on, string theory or supersymmetry, ideas that do not have evidence for their existence, and you do that just in order to impress your peers, you're basically losing the purpose of science, which is to reflect the interests of society and help us figure out the reality that we live in. And a big question is, are we alone? Everyone cares about it.
Yeah, and I kind of wondered, you whether it's astrophysics, physics in general, even anthropology, many different disciplines, it seems like ego gets in the way
Right.
of a lot of progress in wrecking. It's like the people that are most equipped, most educated to be able to do this kind of research, to do this type of analysis, sometimes won't admit when they come across something that disproves what they may have written books on, what they may have spent most of their life teaching. How big of a problem do you think that is? Or am I exaggerating it?
It's a huge problem. And, I'm teaching a class that is obligatory to our graduate students. And it's about electromagnetism, radiative processes in astrophysics. And in the first class, I asked the class, what is the strongest force in academia? It's definitely not gravity. It's not electromagnetism. It's jealousy.
Mm.
And that comes to your point. And it's really frustrating because, we can actually accomplish much more if we remain open-minded. And there is this mindset of being dogmatic and saying, we can guess the answer in advance. We know the answer because it flatters our ego if we base the answer to anomalies that we see. We base it on what we already know because we have our stature, we are regarded as experts based on what we already know. And therefore, there is a lot of resistance to gaining new knowledge because in that case, it means that as an expert, you didn't know something. And people feel that it actually hurts their ego. So it's not just the success of another person that they are objecting to, but also figuring out something that would violate that, they are the world experts on a subject. And instead, what they should think about is, let's be curious. If there is something that is different, then it's an opportunity to learn something new, just like a kid, the mindset of a curious kid. And the best way to tell the difference between a dogmatist and a curious scientist is to give both of them a lot of data. While the scientist would be thrilled, the genuine scientist that is curious will be thrilled with more data because it allows them to learn something new. And especially if it violates what we already know, that would be amazing, right? You learn something. The dogmatist is worried about that this would go against the body of knowledge that established their stature or prestige, and that is really the conflict between the Vatican and Galileo, as an example, but it comes into modern life in academia, and I think it's really unfortunate. Now, on top of that, the fact that the ego gets in the way, there is the question of attending to questions that the public cares about, that matter to society. And again, universities, academia lost their memory of serving society. Like this was the case during the Manhattan Project. It was the case when there was work that is in service of society. And over the decades, even physicists that gained funding through the success of the Manhattan Project, the fact that physics is useful for the defense of the nation, they forgot about it and started working on esoteric issues that have no implications for technology, no implications for society at large. And it's not as if there aren't questions that they can address. They just don't find those questions useful to basically show off that they are smart. And that's unfortunate. So I think we need to remind those people, and perhaps it's happening now, but this is what I'm trying to do as well.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up funding, and I think that's interesting. I was thinking about this as well. For scientists, for people in academia, a big part of the job is seeking funding and getting your research funded. Is that skewing the direction that the places that science is looking, that is choosing to research? Is there a bias towards what is most likely to get funded instead of what is most useful to the population at large?
No, so the problem is that the funding agencies like the National Science Foundation or NASA or the Department of Energy, they make decisions about funding based on committees that are populated by traditional thinkers, people who are dogmatic, who are basically giving the awards to their friends that that are in their echo chamber. So you have an echo chamber where people say the same thing, and they educate students and postdocs to say the same thing, and that's how you get jobs in the job market of academia. But on top of that, the funding agencies are using the same people who are creating these echo chambers to fund their colleagues within those echo chambers. So if there is a challenging idea, something new, they would not fund it because it will shake the foundation of the echo chamber. And so that's the core issue, that in order to foster innovation, you really need to fund the risky projects that are not within the box of what. And of course, you have all these people who are trying to keep the herd tight, and do not allow others to deviate from the beaten path. And they say we should go along this beaten path. But if you look at the history of mainstream physics, for example, there was a very popular idea of supersymmetry that everyone believed in since the time I started doing physics, and people were confident that this new symmetry of nature exists, and therefore we can even build on it. String theory was built on that foundation. And then we went to test it with the Large Hadron Collider at a cost of $10 billion, and we haven't found it in the natural range of parameters. Now, I have no issue with the fact that we haven't found it because, sometimes you go into a dark alley, you don't know what you might find, and but the problem is if you put the herd in a very tight configuration along a single path and you don't find anything, then you lost a lot of time, a lot of resources, and it's a much better approach to diversify your portfolio, to have multiple paths and to have critical paths, people with original ideas that are being funded. And in the context of the search for life, what I'm saying is, instead of just going along the path of searching for microbes, they might be very common, but they are difficult to find. Let's just invest similar funds in a different path, which is currently not funded at all federally, because all the people on the committees keep arguing that we should do what their colleagues are saying we should do, which is this echo chamber of looking for microbes because they are common, but they don't realize that it's challenging to find them, and maybe it's easier to find signs of intelligence, technological signatures. We just need to invest in that the same amount of money because we want to hedge our bets. So the mistake being made is that there is no diversity of multiple paths, multiple opinions for discovery. There should be more risk-taking projects that, people in the commercial sector, in the industries, they recognize that, you have think tanks, blue sky research within the big corporations like Google and Facebook and so forth, and they think broadly, but within academia you don't find it as much, and that is really troubling because academia is all about blue sky research. It's the whole idea of tenure was to allow people job security that prevents them from being chained to traditional ideas, so they can explore new ideas, and unfortunately they don't do it because of this peer pressure. And I can witness that myself when I'm trying to say something different. I'm being attacked very often personally, and it's really unfortunate.
Yeah, I think this is just another example of why, for so many people, there's failing trust in institutions. The scientific community is an institution, academia is an institution, and like many other institutions, to include the military for that matter, which used to be kind of the gold standard of where trust always was. It's just for a lot of people, they're giving up on the idea that they can trust these institutions.
Well,
But
in the context of science, I just wanted to mention one thing, that the approach taken for conversing with the public was also misguided, because the idea was we will figure out the answer through experiments in physics, let's say, and then make a press conference in which we tell the public the answer. And the public feels like students in a class, like the scientists are lecturing the public what they should know, and it's a one-way street. They are not asking for critical remarks, challenging ideas. They just tell the public with a sense of superiority, and I think that's misguided. And based on my experience, when I went to the Pacific Ocean, I wrote a diary of what we are finding and how I'm thinking about it, and there were millions of people that followed it. Right now, when I write my essays, there are more than 1 million people every month that read my essays on medium.com. And the way I approach it is to be honest that science is a learning experience, and we might be misguided, we have the wrong ideas, but as time goes on, we get more data, more evidence, just like a detective story. And we keep shaping the way we think about the problem by having more data, and the public loves it, because then there is no sense of superiority. You're engaging the public, and anyone within the public could have become a scientist. I got an email from a former Air Force pilot a couple of weeks ago, and the title of the email was "Because of You," and he said, "Because of you," he referred to me. He said, "My daughter now wants to become a scientist. She heard you on television, and she keeps talking about aliens, and that's the biggest compliment that I can get. If a young kid, and I heard it from a number, including a reporter from the London Times, that told me that he read his own story that he wrote about my work to his kids, and now they want to become scientists." It's simply because you can see the human aspect of being vulnerable to you don't know much, you're ignorant about how to solve this, but you are open-minded, and then you collect data, evidence, and that guides you, and it sounds familiar. That's the way we figure out things, and it's fun. And for some reason, the scientific community lost this approach and communicates with the public in a very different way, and the science looks sterile that way because the public is not engaged in the process. So I think that's another way of that there was a mistake made, and it's the way of communicating with the public. I do it in a way that just I can definitely make mistakes. I may be wrong, but I'm completely honest and sincere about what I say. That's the way I think about it right now. That's the way I imagine it to be, but then we get data and we will find out what the truth is.
I think that the interest in science, and particularly your field, is at an all-time high right now because of the willingness of you and some of your other colleagues, as well as other what I would call celebrity scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson or even Carl Sagan. I'm not a scientist myself, so I don't want to opine. I'm sure you have an opinion there. But what I will say is that there are many people that are like you, that being on this podcast right now, that are saying, hey, we need to go talk about what we're doing with the general public. It's not good for business, right? Like, it's not good for the field to say the only people that will ever be exposed to my knowledge, you, is somebody that can afford the privilege of going to an institution like Harvard University or one of the other Ivy Leagues.
Well, there is one difference between me and Neil deGrasse Tyson, and that is that I publish papers. I publish multiple papers every month. I just wrote over the past 2 months 9 papers on 3I Atlas. So the way to think of it is I'm in the trenches with the soldiers. I'm actually doing the work, the scientific work. Neil deGrasse Tyson hasn't published a scientific paper for more than a decade, maybe almost 2 decades. And he is popularizing the results of other scientists and making it, he's very eloquent and explains it very well to the public, but it's different it's different to do the work of science and talk about it as compared to someone who just watches science being done by others and talks about it. And it's a difference between uh, people who make movies and those who comment on on the movies they make. I'm actually writing scientific papers, getting them peer reviewed, publishing them, writing textbooks on the science that I'm doing. So in a way, the fact that I communicate to the public is just an extra layer. But the fundamental layer of the message that I bring to the public is this is how science is done. I describe my own work in the trenches.
Yeah, and I'm not in a position to judge one way or the other, but I think it's good any way that we can spread the word and stoke interest in the scientific community. I think is a net gain for everybody, and that's a gateway. Somebody like me may have come into being interested in this topic via Neil deGrasse Tyson, but then make my way to a guy like you and other more people, like you said, that are more boots on the ground in the research and on the bleeding edge of these things. Everybody needs their gateway drug, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
But we're getting close on time here. There's a few other things that I wanted to ask about. You brought up Congresswoman Luna earlier in the interview, and she's doing some interesting work in Congress right now with a few other congressmen on UAPs and I'll wave my hand generally here, other things. But there's a lot of video evidence that's been released over the last couple of years. A lot of material made public. You're aware of most, if not all of it, I imagine. What do you feel like what's your assessment of everything that you're seeing come out right now? And what do you feel reasonably certain saying we still haven't seen yet? Like, based off what you're seeing, like, what does the government know that they're not telling us, I guess?
Well, in fact, I did the brief Congress on May 1st, 2025, just several months ago, and met Representative Luna there. And I think she has a visionary program to figure out what the government might know and is not telling us. And frankly, I really don't know, because the day before that, I visited the Pentagon and met with the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office that is supposed to look back at reports from military personnel. And I asked them, we were sitting around the table, they invited me, and I said, look, can you tell me, you've been checking this for a couple of years, did you find anything? First, do you have access to all the information? They said, we have access to all the information, we haven't found anything unusual except some reports from FBI agents. And a day later, I go to Congress, and next to me sits Eric Davis, and he was saying that he worked within government and knows about a dozen craft that were retrieved from crash sites, and with 4 types of alien pilots in them. Now, the fundamental question, as far as I'm concerned, I don't have access to the information or data. I cannot judge. Mm-hmm. One of them is not telling me the truth. You're right. So it can't be that both are right, and who is not is difficult.
Also, I like, just to interrupt here a little bit. I come from a special operations background. I understand how there's for things that you don't want directly attributable to the government, you hire contractors, you hire defense contractors.
Yes.
And so when you say that somebody told you they have access to all the information, my follow-up question to that would be, okay, do you have access to all the information that was organically sourced by the Department of Defense or DNI? Are you including private corporations, name any of them, who may be very interested in UAPs?
No, that's an excellent that's an excellent question. Now, on top of that, you have people who are spreading misinformation or unreliable evidence. So even in the last congressional hearing, we saw a video that was just shown for the first time of a Hellfire missile that was shot at an object that was called an unidentified anomalous phenomena, or UAP, near Yemen. Okay, and so I looked at the video, and there was a date when it was taken near Yemen, and I checked, and around that date, the Houthis were shooting drones at Israel, at southern Israel, and then I know the parameters of the Hellfire missile. I know the speed of the Hellfire missile and the size of the Hellfire missile. So I could see it touching this object. So when they are in contact, I can tell the relative size of the two because they're at the same distance from the camera.
Mhm.
So, and then I can also tell the speed because before they get into contact, I can tell how much is this UAP moving relative to how much is the Hellfire missile moving. So knowing the speed of Hellfire missiles, I could tell that so the Hellfire moves at about 440 meters per second. This object was moving at 50 meters per second, and then the size was also characteristic of the size of drones. And now the question is, why didn't we see evidence for the wings? I don't know what this object was, but the fact that the Houthis were using objects that are of this dimension with this speed, that's the speed of the drones that they were using at the time, to me says that it's very terrestrial. This object that was, and a Hellfire missile was designed as an anti-tank weapons. It detonates when it impacts a tank, the armor of a tank. But if it impacts a soft object that is in air, it actually did not detonate. It broke a few pieces. So I said, well, this is probably not extraterrestrial. Okay, it's close to the Houthis, near Yemen. The timing is just around the time where they were using drones of this size, this speed. So I said, no, it's not a UAP. It's actually very terrestrial. And of course, I immediately was criticized by those who want to be believers. Now, the point of the matter is, you need to really look at the flight characteristics of the object to tell whether it's beyond human-made technologies. And this object was not. Okay, so let's leave it. So the only thing is that the Hellfire missile did not explode. Okay, but that's because it was probably a soft target. It didn't, or the Hellfire missile didn't have a detonation trigger. I'm not sure what the reason is, but the point is, this is not necessarily extraterrestrial. Now, of course, there are reports about things that are extremely unusual. And the director of national intelligence talked about events, even some of them, Ratcliffe, when he was director of national intelligence, he was talking about satellite data. And so altogether, I do think that the government may have data, but it's classified for obvious reasons because it was taken by classified sensors. If they have objects that they can be sure are not terrestrial, are not human-made, it's not in their purview, it's not in their jurisdiction to figure out what lies outside the solar system. They should focus on national security threats. And I would be delighted to help them figure out anything that came from outside the solar system. So I do think that they should allow for that, for scientific research, if they have something. I haven't seen it, but I'm leading the Galileo Project, which just constructed 3 observatories looking at unusual objects in the sky. And the latest one is actually this week is being completed with 3 units that would allow us to triangulate and figure out the distance of an object in the sky, the speed, the acceleration. So my hope is we will be able to, within the coming year, to look at a few million objects and check if any of them goes beyond the flight characteristics of human-made objects. And I also told my research team in the Galileo Project, I said, we should check after 3i Atlas passes by whether there is any enhanced activity.
Yeah, and the flight characteristics, I think that's the one thing that stood out to me about the Yemen UAP and the Hellfire. It didn't change course dramatically or anything. Some of the video that we've seen from Navy pilots off San Diego, they show objects that are accelerating, decelerating, stop, go, like things that just are not, as far as we know, a capability that anybody on Earth currently possesses. Exactly. Whereas the UAP in the Yemen video that just came out recently, even after impact, it continued on almost like it was a drone not intelligently operated because it just kept going at the same rate, the same speed, as far as I could tell.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is you find these conspiracy theories that, for example, argue that, I came up with the discussion about 3i Atlas to deflect the attention from the Epstein files. Now, I cannot be that powerful. I would need to be more powerful than the Pope to do that, because this object was 4.5 times farther than the sun is from Earth, and and actually it was looked at from 227 observatories on Earth and the space telescopes like the Hubble Space Telescope, James Webb. So you can't arrange a fake object at such a huge distance. I have no power to do that. And so I told those people, that come up with these ideas that they can buy a 0.5 meter telescope online and they can see this object. This object is in the sky. There is no way for me to fabricate the existence of this object. And whether it's anomalous or not is not up to us. We observe it, we see some anomalies, so we should discuss them. So I think an important point to recognize is that we should be guided by data, by evidence, and rather than by stories that people tell us. And that's the way we will find higher meaning to our existence.
As far as higher meaning, a lot of people approach, and this is probably my last question here. When people think about the meaning of life and sort of the larger philosophical questions we have, a lot of people look at it through the lens of religion, of whatever religion they were raised in. And I kind of wonder, as you've already illustrated with the Vatican's reaction, the Catholic Church's reaction to Galileo, how do you approach the idea that the possibility of extraterrestrial life is at odds with the major Abrahamic religions?
Yeah. So on that, I'll say two things. One, in 1883, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche declared God is dead. And that led to a whole century of hubris, where we had science, technology, and humans, became very arrogant as to what our abilities are. They are unlimited. There is nothing more intelligent than we are, and so forth. And my hope, we desperately need a sense of modesty. And my hope is that we will get that sense of modesty once we realize that there is something more intelligent than we are. And it could be in the form of artificial intelligence, that our own product, technological project, or alien intelligence. Now, I had a group of religious scholars from the organization Christianity Today that came to visit me at Harvard. And they said, well, if we find evidence for extraterrestrials, would that shake our religious belief in God? And I said, I have two daughters. And when the second one was born, it didn't take away any of the love that I have to the first one. So imagining God as a parent that can attend only to a single child is very limiting. If you want to think of God as very capable, then obviously God can attend to multiple civilizations. We may have siblings among the stars. And the only issue with that, it will actually, if you believe in God, it should make your belief even stronger, because it's quite amazing to realize that there are many kids to that parent, but the only issue might be that if you get jealous at one of your siblings because they're more accomplished than you are, that may happen to us if we see. But that's a secondary issue. I think it will only strengthen religious beliefs if we find that we are not alone. And, it's like finding members of our family that we didn't know about.
I completely agree. And I've always felt that way about science. I feel like the more we advance in science, the more we prove many religious beliefs right. One, I think the big notable thing that I point out is, the Bible starts off with "there will be light," and go figure, we've discovered the Big Bang, and
yes, exactly.
There's a lot of things that we can point to, and I'll point to as well, just like the book of Ezekiel. If we didn't have that as a religious text, and the things that are described in the book of Ezekiel just happened, we would call those aliens. We would call those extraterrestrial. Like, there would be a lot of different things going on. But I think it's so interesting.
The way to think about science is, just like examining a watch. Okay, so you see the watch. If you don't examine it, you might say, okay, someone made it, but you won't really appreciate the qualities of whoever made it. If you want to, if you believe in God and you want to appreciate God, you want to know the details of what the watch contains, what the universe contains. And to me, the biggest signature of love is that you want to know everything possible about the subject of your love. if you're really in love with a particular person, you want to know everything about them. And the same must be true of religious love. And if you believe in God, you want to know everything possible about the universe that resulted from that divine entity. And therefore, what science is doing is allowing you to appreciate the subtlety, the richness of the universe. And it can only contribute to your sense of wonder rather than take anything away from it.
I completely agree. And Professor Loeb, I really appreciate you taking time to come on and talk to me today. This is really important discussion to have, and I really look forward to seeing what you have to say as 3i Atlas gets closer and we get some of those higher resolution images. And I'll point out that you have your most recent book is Interstellar. Right. You have one before that called Extraterrestrial.
And there is a third one that
coming.
I just finished last week, and it's now with the publisher. It will probably take a year before it comes out in summer 2026. It's about the expedition to the Pacific Ocean.
I look forward to that as well. At some point, I'm about an hour north of you. At some point, I'm going to proposition you to sign this book and maybe that next one. But thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. I'll also make sure that I link to your Medium essays in the description of these videos. And just again, thank you for taking the time.
My honor and privilege to speak with you. Thank you.